Our guest on this edition of CityWide is Joseph Mercurio, who's worked as a political consultant for more than 30 years. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Joe, you have worked on presidential campaigns, congressional races, local races. You've taught politics. You have a long perspective. My sense is that there is a discontent and a disconnect between ordinary Americans and political leadership, the likes of which I don't recall since the late 60s and early 70s. Is that right? What's going on?
There is a very large portion of the electorate that's not happy with the way government is operated, particularly in Washington. And, you know, it's also a growing incivility among political players that's happening, the likes of which I've never seen. Years ago, you'd go into a city working as a political consultant, you'd know other people were in town, everybody'd get together for a poker game, and you'd talk and exchange ideas and argue issues. Today, we're gonna get you, we're gonna kill you, we're gonna bury your candidate. The rhetoric in conversation, even in private, is different.
But it also has the impact on the voters where I think for a lot of voters, it's all blah, blah, blah. Whether they agree with the person that's saying it or not, there's a hunger out there for solutions, and yet there seems to be just a tremendous vacuum, nationally.
Well, there are a large portion of people who their incomes are lower, they're not getting jobs when they get laid off, they're not getting the overtime they need, their children, when they get out of school, aren't getting jobs quickly. It isn't the American dream they were expecting, and they thought government would do more to fix it, and they see a lot of people just arguing about it, and arguing about it in a way, not our way is going to make it better, but in some ways shutting it down. I mean,
Well, the Tea Party argues, and I think it's ironic that they're paraphrasing a Black Panther, Eldridge Cleaver, but the Tea Party argues that government is not the solution, government is the problem.
Well, you look around, you can't cross a street, walk on a sidewalk, get a telephone call without government. Government is pervasive, and government historically has had a tremendous impact on creating wealth in America and commerce and growth and creating jobs. The notion that government doesn't do that kind of thing is kind of silly. I mean, and you live in a place like New York, the Erie Canal was a tremendous economic benefit to New York City and New York State and its growth. You look at the railroads before the Civil War, and you look at the telegraph and airports and the highway system that Eisenhower did. Wherever you look, government has done things that are great and created tremendous wealth in the private sector.
But I think there's also, we've had 30, 40 years of disillusionment. Whether you want to date it to the Kennedy assassination or Iran-Contra or whatever scandals or lies our national leaders have been involved with, there's the sense that even if we tried to dream big dreams, either they wouldn't be successful or they would be so corrupted by special interests that they're not worth the effort.
Well, there's a feeling that when we've done things, it hasn't really been about greatness. Even when we did the recent stimulus package, a lot of the money was to go to highways and infrastructure. Instead of building a new bridge or repairing an old bridge, maybe they put up sound barriers along a highway, something quick, not really something that affected the economy. It just spent money.
An excuse for spending money.
Yeah, we needed something more than just pyramid building, and people are wondering if there's a disconnect in Washington. Do these guys actually get it, that they have to actually impact on our lives in ways that make it better, or are they just spending money?
So let's talk about the argument for a second, because as a political consultant, part of what you do is help shape the argument for the candidates that you represent. It seems to me that the Tea Party influenced Republican Party has done a much better job of framing their arguments than the Democrats and their allies in labor and others have done. When the country got into trouble because of loose lending limitations, people took advantage of it, and then the house of cards fell down. When Democrats talked about trying to hold bankers accountable for this, the Republicans said it was a blame game. That didn't sound right to the American public. When Democrats talk about fairness, that people at the top should have less tax breaks and pay more of their fair share, Republicans say that's class warfare. That's not the American way. Why aren't the Democrats better at articulating why their prescription for the country is better for the country?
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. In the Obama campaign, the last time, was masterful about not only technology and utilizing new technology and social networking, they were masterful about framing the conversation.
Hope. Hope. The whole campaign, one word,
yeah,
hope.
They took control utterly of the conversation in the country. And not only did he win big, but he also brought a lot of people into the House and in state legislatures. It was a marvelous campaign. You go to the midterm election, and it was almost like the national agenda and the Obama message couldn't be part of the conversation. It was almost purposefully not part of the conversation because there were so many blue dog Democrats who were picked because they could win in conservative districts that nobody wanted to ruffle those contested areas with the Tea Party growing. And as a result, they wound up throwing out with the bathwater a ton of other moderate Democrats. So it's kind of ironic. The Tea Party knocked out a few Republican senators and some congressmen and a whole bunch of conservative Democratic congressmen.
So what should Democrats be saying now?
Well, they got to get back on message. I mean, even the tax conversation now that sounds tax to rich, and the Republicans are trying to paint it as class warfare. Well, they've been engaging in class warfare against the middle class for the last decade. But Obama's not even talking about taxing the rich. He's talking about tax fairness. There are rich people who are paying way less tax than other rich people. And part of it is hedge fund operators and people who make most of their money from capital gains.
So you're for killing jobs?
No.
That's what the Tea Party would say.
The only jobs that get created by rich people are in Hermes and some other stores. The only retail stores today that are doing any kind of business are the very high-end stores. Even Macy's and most run-of-the-mill stores aren't doing any kind of numbers. The middle class is losing wages. They're not getting the income they used to have. They don't have any growth whatsoever, and there's piles of people out of work.
So I was at an event recently where Mort Zuckerman, publisher of the Daily News, very successful real estate operator, developer, U.S. News and World Report, and generally considered to be a thoughtful person, talked about his disappointment in the president not doing enough to compromise with the Republican leadership and being in John Boehner's district and in his face. And yet, another event recently, Joe Crowley, Democratic congressman, considered a moderate, a deal maker, part of the leadership in the House Democratic structure, talking about the fact that, as you alluded to earlier, that Republicans aren't interested in compromising or interested in discussing the merits of any of the president's proposals. So if you were advising the president, how would you seize the high ground in this national debate? Is it that he's being too conciliatory or not conciliatory enough? And what should he be saying about his approach?
Well, he's got a problem that he has to actually work with the House to get anything done. But if this was Lyndon Johnson or some of the older, masterful congressional players, they would start closing army bases in some of these guys' districts and post offices and moving people around and delaying projects and favoring other districts. The president is much more balanced and cooperative and collegial than this Congress is. There are 20, 25 members of the House, the real radical Republicans, who spend all their time meeting to figure out how to stop government from operating and how to defeat Obama.
So it's going to take an election. Crowley made the point, it's going to take an election. Can the Democrats win the House? And if they can, how do they do that?
Well, the Democrats can win the House. They could, if they specifically talk about who's causing the problem and get the message out in those districts that these people are not interested in improving the economy, they're interested simply in politics and power, they could make inroads. There are places where they could take seats. You look at the Massachusetts Senate race. New candidate coming in, she's already polling.
Elizabeth
pretty
Warren,
much,
right?
Elizabeth Warren, polling even with the incumbent Republican, even though almost 40% of the electorate doesn't know anything about her yet. And she's already even with the incumbent. She's in the race for less than a month. There are races like that that could be, and there's a candidate who's really talking about how things have to be done to change the economy and deal with the middle class and create jobs, and confronting the Republican conversation that somehow smaller government and shutting down the process is going to increase economic development. Corporations are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars in money. More money is lying idle in banks waiting for spending, and then you have circumstances where corporations get big cash positions, they open up plants in foreign countries, they buy back their own stock. They're not investing in new plants and operations and hiring people here to develop. They're waiting. And nobody's exploiting the possibility of all that money coming into the economy and really doing hard work. And when you get a candidate like her saying that something's wrong here with the government policy, it's not favoring working class people and middle class people, it's favoring just a small portion of wealthy people, the voters are responding. And I think the trick for the Democrats next time is to get at turnout, because the vast bulk of the electorate is actually more inclined to be on Obama's side and the Democratic side on the issues than on the Republican side. It's the problem going into the election is more the enthusiasm gap.
We'll pick up that topic when CityWide continues right after this. Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with longtime political consultant Joe Mercurio. According to the National Journal, in something like the last 8 or 9 special elections for Congress, the incumbent state legislator running for Congress against a non-incumbent has lost, regardless of party. In other words, if the local assembly member or a senator was a Democrat or a Republican, it didn't matter. If they ran for the House of Representatives, they lost. We saw that play out to some extent in the 9th Congressional District here in New York. So when you talk about an enthusiasm gap, is there just an anti-incumbent feeling? Statewide, people voted for Andrew Cuomo. At the local level, they voted out 5 Democratic members of the House.
Well, on the one hand, you have people being upset with Obama because he's not tough enough on Republicans. So that's quieted down a lot of the Democratic vote, and it's affecting turnout. But you also have a tremendous disappointment about what elected officials are doing. that they're really not tackling the job. You had in New York the look of the state Senate over the last years until CUOMO took over. New York state government looked like a basket case of governments. Congress looks like it's doing an awful job at running things. So when you get incumbents running, they're in worse shape. It's part of the reason why there's hope for the Democratic Party taking back the House next time, because you have more Republicans in office, and if there's an anti-incumbent feeling, you know, in those marginal districts, that's going to play against incumbent Republicans. If you got an insurgent like you do in Massachusetts in the U.S. Senate race, not a good circumstance for incumbents up there. It's pretty much a Democratic state. You've got a Republican incumbent, and people are anti-incumbent, anti-Congress. An insurgent who's really talking about populist issues and making a coherent case for government making a difference, you could win. You get a race like New York 9 in Brooklyn, Queens, where you have an incumbent elected official. He's been in the council assembly running for office. Yeah, he had good name recognition in his own district, did a little better there. But overall, he didn't really have the appeal because he was an incumbent. This insurgent coming in, saying all those incumbents are doing a bad job, I'm going to really come in and change things, has a big appeal. And I think in some ways it was a mistake to pick an easy candidate like him, somebody who simply has won basically uncontested elections in the past, who wasn't really that good on his feet as a candidate, taking all the blame for the party.
So if you look at the national political scene, some of the most popular figures are governors, or in some cases former governors. So in the metropolitan area, both Christie in New Jersey and Cuomo in New York seem to be strong. Perry is a governor. Romney, you know, has a state background. What is it because executives can do something and legislators just make deals?
Well, it's partly that, but it's also partly the kind of elections governors and senators get into, and the fact that they run more frequently. And they are actually people who administer large bureaucracies. To run for president of the United States, you actually have to be fairly meticulous at management and running a large organization.
How much do you spend on a presidential campaign these days?
Well, it used to be that presidential campaigns would spend, you know, $80, $90 million. But Obama spent $750 million on the last campaign.
And is talking about spending $1 billion.
Could go as high as $1 billion next time, which is an edge for him because, you know, we've in modern times, since they've been doing Gallup polling, we've never had an incumbent president who didn't have a primary lose a presidential election for re-election. So, you know, when you combine the historical leanings and the enormous amount of money he's raising, he's well over 3-to-1 on his nearest opponent on the Republican side, and all the Republican candidates have to spend money on primaries. But governors generally do much better than senators do in, and obviously Obama's an exception, in running for president. But every one of the Republicans, you look over the last several months, you've had basically a flavor of the month. One of the candidates surges in the polls and then drops down when he's getting scrutiny. You've had that happen with Romney, Bachmann, Perry, you know, the latest one, Cain.
So Herman Cain wins a couple of straw polls, but the focus of the national media still seems to be on a Romney-Perry race. Or maybe Christie will get into it. Mm-hmm. Is that because the reporters that cover Cain don't really believe that he has the ability to do this, or is it racism, or is it just institutional bias? Or
well, you even had Ron Paul doing much better numbers than some of the other candidates. I mean, he did fairly well in early polling, and he wasn't looked at all, and he's even raising serious money. I think part of the problem is that there's more than 30% of the electorate on the Republican side people who are likely primary voters who don't like any of these candidates and keep wishing for some giant figure to enter the race. And I don't think, you know, when you look at the way Perry entered, gigantic buildup, great expectations, and then he collapsed. There's no reason to assume that even though Christie, for all intents and purposes, is the real thing when it comes to candidates. He's very good on his feet. He's very good at running the government. You might disagree with him on issues and made different decisions than him, but he's competent and he doesn't buy into and can get away with not buying into a lot of the far right stuff that would make him not palatable in a general election. But he's not been a governor for very long.
Right.
He doesn't have great name recognition beyond his immediate state.
So let me pivot to the local scene, because in the last mayoral election, the Bloomberg strategy was to portray invincibility. The reporters refused to take the Thompson campaign seriously. Clearly, there were some things that Thompson could have done differently, better, more strong, but they managed to make it impossible even for traditional Democratic allies to come out and support him. The president didn't come in to do the usual, you know, October visit to the city. So now we're in a we're not in 2009 anymore. We're looking at the 2013 race. We don't think Bloomberg's running again. Polls show that his endorsement might actually hurt a candidate, not help them. Do you think that the political class and the media learned anything from the fact that the polls were wrong, Thompson was in fact within a hair of becoming the mayor, and that the conventional political wisdom didn't really apply?
Well, you know, about the polls, I mean, you could say the polls were wrong because they gave the impression that it wasn't going to be as close as it turned out.
Except for Jeff Garen, except for Thompson's own poll, which had it right.
Polling, when you do it as a political consultant, the purpose of polling is not to find out where the two candidates are. You're finding out issues, you're finding out how to talk about the campaign, you're finding out how to change the outcome. The purpose of polling in politics is how do you change the outcome, not predicting the outcome. And I think because a lot of people in the press and a lot of labor union leaders and a lot of, you know, heads of big organizations sort of, oh, well, he's not that bad. You know, crime rates are low and he's got a lot of money to spend. It's going to be hard to run against them. They just didn't bother running a race.
So now we have an open race, and now the polls are showing none of the candidates with more than 20%. The half a dozen on the Democratic side, unclear who's on the Republican side except John Katzimatidis. Possibly, who can self-fund the campaign. You don't have the same kind of ideological outcry, I think, on the, you know, from the Republicans. But a lot of the attention is paid to people who have basically said they're not candidates. So among the Democratic field today, who's the next mayor of the city of New York?
Well, it could be that the next Democratic mayor or the next mayor of New York isn't even in the race yet. You know, this race is still fairly open. There are candidates who aren't running who are polling high. The speaker is doing very good numbers, but she, you know, has inherent problems. Speakers generally don't do that well in mayoral elections. You look at it historically. It's not a great title. She's got a lot of attachments to the mayor. You've got a Brooklyn borough president whose numbers are fairly high. He's probably not even running, and his numbers are high just because he represents a big borough and he has a Jewish name, and it you know, it sounds nice. There are other candidates who are very competent candidates who just aren't people who've had, you know, contested elections that made them.
But with term limits, you know 4 years in advance there's an opening. With campaign finance, you got to go out and do a lot of small fundraising to be competitive. Is it realistic to think that there were going to be candidates entering the field other than Bill de Blasio, John Liu, Bill Thompson, Christine Quinn, Scott Stringer?
What I find fascinating is with the matching funds that you have in New York City and with the ability to raise money on the internet these days from small donors, there are surprising little activity by any of these candidates in terms of developing social networks and raising money on the internet.
Well, the last candidate that put a major effort into that, he had 48,000 people following him on Twitter, was Anthony Weiner. That may have spooked a few people.
You know, you have to use it properly, and a lot of candidates tend to use Facebook and Twitter and the other mediums as if they're junk mail. I mean, even when David Patterson was trying to resurrect his governor's race, I think the highest number of views he got on his best YouTube video were 72 people. You have to have a product, and you have to use it like it's old-time field operations. You have to use people like they're building captains and so on. It's not junk mail.
But by the way, many people follow you on Facebook, including myself. My thanks to political consultant Joe Mercurio. I'm Ken Fisher. Thanks for joining us on this edition of CityWide.